In 1987, a beloved black preacher vanished without explanation from a small Georgia town, leaving behind only questions and a congregation in mourning. 37 years later, his son James Washington would discover that some secrets refuse to stay buried, especially when they're hidden in plain sight. James sat in his cramped Atlanta apartment on a Sunday morning, the silence pressing against him like a weight he'd grown accustomed to carrying. The digital clock on his nightstand read 9:47 a.m., and he knew that across the city, church bells were calling the faithful to worship. He used to love that sound. Now it only reminded him of everything he'd lost. The remote control felt heavy in his hand as he flipped through channels, avoiding anything that might show a congregation singing or a preacher delivering Sunday's message. He'd perfected this ritual over the years, sleeping late on Sundays, staying indoors, keeping himself busy with anything that didn't involve stepping foot inside a sanctuary. Faith had once been the cornerstone of his life, inherited from his father like brown eyes and broad shoulders. But faith, he'd learned, could crumble just as easily as it could be built. The coffee maker gurgled in the kitchen, filling the apartment with the rich aroma that had become his Sunday morning communion. James closed his eyes and let the familiar bitterness wash over him. 37 years since his father, Reverend Samuel Washington, had simply disappeared from Mount Calvary Baptist Church. 37 years of unanswered prayers, failed investigations, and a community that eventually moved on while James remained frozen in that terrible summer of 1987. He was reaching for his coffee mug when the phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the morning quiet like a blade. James considered letting it go to voicemail. Sunday calls were usually telemarketers or distant relatives checking on his spiritual well-being. But something made him answer. "Mr. Washington, this is Linda. Hayes from Peachtree Properties." The woman's voice was professional but tinged with uncertainty. "I'm calling about the Miller Farm property we're handling. I think we found something that belongs to your family." James's coffee mug froze halfway to his lips. "I'm sorry, what?" "We're clearing out the old barn for the estate sale, and we found a choir robe with your father's name embroidered inside. So I thought you should know before we—" The mug slipped from James's fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor. The Miller Farm sat 15 miles outside town, a collection of weathered buildings that time had forgotten. James pulled his Honda into the gravel driveway, his hands still trembling from the phone call 2 hours earlier. The property agent's car was already there, along with a sheriff's cruiser that made his stomach clench with familiar dread. Sheriff Patricia Reeves stepped out of her vehicle as James approached, her grey hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun. She'd been a deputy back in 1987, one of the few officers who'd seemed to take his father's disappearance seriously. Now she wore the badge with the weight of years behind it. "James," she said, extending her hand, "I'm sorry we're meeting again under these circumstances." Linda Hayes emerged from behind the barn, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and nervous energy. "Mr. Washington, thank you for coming so quickly. I wasn't sure if I should have called you directly, but when I saw the name—" The barn loomed before them, its red paint faded to rust and memory. James had driven past this property countless times over the years, never knowing it held secrets. The massive doors hung askew on ancient hinges, and the smell hit him immediately. Dust, decay, and something else, something that reminded him of Sunday mornings when the world still made sense. "It's in the back corner," Linda said, leading them into the shadows. "We were clearing out old farm equipment when we found it hanging on a nail behind some hay bales." The barn's interior was a cavern of forgotten things. Sunlight streamed through gaps in the roof, illuminating dust motes that danced like spirits in the stale air. James followed Linda deeper into the darkness, his footsteps echoing off the wooden walls. And then he saw it. The choir robe hung like a ghost against the weathered planks, its deep purple fabric faded but unmistakable. James's breath caught in his throat. He could see his father's hands adjusting those same sleeves before Sunday service, could hear his rich baritone voice leading the congregation in amazing grace. "Samuel Washington," Sheriff Reeves read from the embroidered nameplate inside. The collar. "This is definitely his." James reached out with shaking fingers to touch the fabric. It was softer than he remembered, worn smooth by years of faithful service. The material still held traces of his father's cologne, Old Spice and hope. "How long has it been here?" James whispered. Linda shook her head. "Could be decades. The Miller family never came out here much after old Henry died." Sheriff Reeves was already on her radio, calling for the crime scene unit. The white steeple of Mount Calvary Baptist Church pierced the afternoon sky like an accusation. James sat in his car across the street, engine running, hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned pale. 37 years since he'd last walked through those doors. 37 years of driving past this corner and looking the other way. Sheriff Reeves had suggested he speak with the current pastor about his father's records. Standard procedure, she'd said. But nothing about this felt standard to James. Every brick of that building held memories he'd spent decades trying to forget. The front steps were the same weathered concrete where he'd sat as a boy, polishing his father's shoes before Sunday service. The oak doors still bore the brass nameplate that had once read Reverend Samuel Washington, before being replaced with Pastor Jerome Miller. James forced himself to walk forward, each step feeling like a betrayal of his carefully constructed distance. Pastor Miller met him in the foyer, a man in his 50s with gentle eyes and prematurely grey hair. "Mr. Washington, I've been expecting you." Sheriff Reeves called ahead. His handshake was firm, searching. "I'm honored to finally meet Samuel's son." The sanctuary stretched before them, unchanged except for fresh paint and new carpet. The same wooden pews his father had blessed, the same pulpit where he'd delivered sermons that could make grown men weep. James felt his chest tighten. "Your father was a giant here," Pastor Miller said softly. "Even after all these years, people still talk about his ministry." Mrs. Dorothy Ellis shuffled toward them from the front pew, her silver hair crowned with the same pink hat she'd worn to every service James could remember. Her face lit up with recognition and sorrow. "Little James Washington," she whispered, reaching for his hands. "Look how you've grown. You have your daddy's eyes." The words hit him like a physical blow. James had to steady himself against a pew, the same pew where his family had sat every Sunday, front row center. He could almost see his father's ghost standing at the pulpit, arms raised in blessing. "Mrs. Ellis," he managed, "you look exactly the same." She smiled through tears. "Child, I've been praying for you to come home for 37 years. Pastor Miller cleared his throat gently. "We'd like to help with the investigation however we can, though I'm afraid the church records from your father's time are incomplete." James looked up sharply. "Incomplete how?" "Several boxes went missing years ago. Nobody knows when or how." The sheriff's office smelled of stale coffee and bureaucracy, a combination that immediately transported James back to 1987. He'd spent countless hours in these same plastic chairs as a 15-year-old boy, watching officers shuffle papers and make phone calls that led nowhere. Now at 42, he found himself in the exact same position. Sheriff Reeves spread the original case files across her desk like a poker hand with missing cards. The manila folders were thin, embarrassingly, so for a missing person case, Deputy Martinez, a young man with earnest eyes and careful hands, stood behind her with a box marked Washington Samuel, 1987. "This is everything?" James asked, staring at the meager collection of documents. "That's what troubles me, Sheriff," Reeves admitted. "A prominent community leader disappears without a trace, and we have maybe 30 pages of documentation. No follow-up interviews after the first week, no expanded search radius, no federal involvement." Deputy Martinez opened the evidence box. Inside were a few photographs, some handwritten witness statements, and a single evidence bag containing his father's car keys, found in the church parking lot the morning after he vanished. "Where are the financial records?" James asked, remembering his father's meticulous bookkeeping. Dad documented everything, every penny that came through that church. Sheriff Reeves and Deputy Martinez exchanged glances. "That's another problem," the deputy said. "According to the original report, no financial irregularities were found, but there's no actual audit documentation in the file." James picked up one of the witness statements, recognizing the shaky handwriting of Mrs. Ellis. Her account was brief, almost dismissive. Reverend Washington seemed troubled the week before he left. Perhaps he needed time away to think and pray. Left? James's voice rose. She never believed he left. I was there when they interviewed her. She said something was wrong, that he would never abandon his congregation. Deputy Martinez pulled out a typed report. According to Detective Harold Brennan's summary, all witnesses agreed that Reverend Washington had been acting strangely and likely departed voluntarily. The name hit James like a slap. Detective Brennan had been the lead investigator, a man with cold eyes and a dismissive attitude toward the grieving teenager who kept insisting his father wouldn't just leave. James remembered Brennan's exact words, "Boy, sometimes good men do bad things, sometimes they just run." Brennan retired in 1995, Sheriff Reeves said quietly, moved to Florida. But his handling of this case, she shook her head. So let's just say investigative standards were different back then. James studied the crime scene photos of his father's empty office. Everything looked normal, organized, ready for the next day's work. No signs of struggle, no indication of hasty departure. What about the Miller farm? James asked. Was it ever searched? Deputy Martinez flipped through the file twice before looking up. There's no record of searching any properties beyond the church and your family home. The room fell silent, except for the hum of fluorescent lights. James felt the familiar anger building in his chest, the same rage that had consumed him as a teenager when adults refused to listen. Someone didn't want my father found, he said quietly. Mel's diner hadn't changed since James was a boy. Same red vinyl booths, same grease-stained menu, same elderly waitress who seemed to know everyone's business before they did. Beulah Jenkins had been pouring coffee and collecting secrets for 40 years, her silver beehive hairdo as permanent a fixture as the neon sign outside. James slid into a corner booth across from Ruth Chen, the town's unofficial historian and retired librarian. Ruth had called him that morning, claiming she had information about the Miller family that might interest him. Her wire-rimmed glasses reflected the fluorescent lights as she spread photocopied documents across the Formica table. Henry Miller owned that farm from 1962 until his death in 2003, Ruth said, her voice barely above a whisper. But here's what's interesting. He had a son, Jerome, who inherited the property. James nearly choked on his coffee. Jerome Miller, as in Pastor Jerome Miller. Beulah appeared at their table with the coffee pot, her timing suspiciously perfect. You're talking about the Miller boy. That child had a rough go of it. She refilled their cups without being asked, clearly settling in for conversation. Ruth shot Beulah a warning look, but the waitress had already committed to the story. Henry Miller was a hard man, especially after his wife passed. Jerome grew up out there on that farm, but he spent most of his time at Mount Calvary. Your daddy took that boy under his wing. The words hit James like cold water. His father had mentored Jerome Miller, the same Jerome who now pastored his father's church. Jerome was maybe 16, 17 when your daddy disappeared, Beulah continued, lowering her voice as other patrons filtered in for lunch. Broke that boy's heart. He always said Reverend Washington was the closest thing to a real father he ever had. Ruth pulled out another document, a property deed transfer. Jerome inherited the farm when Henry died, but he never lived there, kept it as rental property for years before putting it up for sale last month. James studied the timeline, his investigative instincts sharpening. So Jerome would have had access to that barn all these years, and he never mentioned knowing my father personally when we met yesterday. That boy's been carrying guilt about something for decades, Beulah said, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. Shows up in a man's eyes, you know. Some burdens are too heavy to hide. Ruth leaned forward. There's something else. I found old church board meeting minutes from 1987. Jerome was officially brought on as youth pastor just 2 weeks after your father disappeared. The implications settled over James like a shroud. The current pastor of Mount Calvary had personal and professional connections to both his father and the location where the choir robe was found, and he'd said nothing about any of it. James stood abruptly, leaving money on the table. I need to pay Pastor Miller another visit. Pastor Jerome Miller's home was a modest ranch house 3 blocks from the church, its front yard meticulously maintained and bordered by his wife's prize-winning roses. James rang the doorbell twice before Jerome answered. his face immediately, shifting from welcoming to wary when he saw who stood on his porch. "James, I wasn't expecting you. We need to talk, Pastor, about your father's barn." Jerome's shoulders sagged slightly, as if a weight he'd been carrying had suddenly grown heavier. He stepped aside without a word, leading James through a living room filled with family photos and theological books to his home study. The walls were lined with seminary diplomas and pictures of church events, but James noticed what wasn't there. No photos of Jerome as a young man, no family pictures from before his marriage. "You know," Jerome said, settling into his desk chair while James remained standing, "I wondered when this conversation would come. 37 years seems like a long time to wait," James replied, his voice steady but cold. "You've been pastoring my father's church, sitting in his office, using his pulpit, and you never once mentioned that you knew him personally." Jerome's hands trembled slightly as he reached for a glass of water. "Your father was a great man, James, a giant of faith. I didn't want to burden you with my connection to his story." "Burden me?" James stepped closer to the desk. "Jerome, they found his choir robe in your family's barn. How is that a burden rather than evidence?" "Because I know how it looks." Jerome's voice cracked. "The son of Henry Miller raised on that property, inheriting the land where evidence was found. I've been waiting for someone to connect those dots my entire ministry." James studied the man's face, searching for deception but finding only anguish. "Then tell me the truth, all of it." Jerome stood and walked to the window, staring out at his carefully tended garden. "Your father saved my life, James. I mean that literally. My father, Henry, was a hard man with a worse temper. When he drank, which was often he used his fists to make his points, I was 17, angry, ready to run away or worse. And my father intervened. He gave me purpose, made me youth pastor, taught me that God's love was bigger than earthly fathers. He was preparing me to take over his ministry someday." Jerome turned back to face James, tears streaming down his cheeks. "The night he disappeared, we were supposed to meet. He'd called that afternoon, said he needed to discuss something important about the church, about moving forward with my ordination." James felt his anger wavering, replaced by confusion. "You were supposed to meet him the night he vanished. I waited at the church until midnight. He never showed." Jerome's voice dropped to a whisper. "I've wondered every day for 37 years if I could have saved him." The room fell silent, except for the tick of an antique clock on the mantel. James wanted to maintain his suspicion, his righteous anger, but Jerome's grief seemed too raw to be fabricated. "Who else knew about that meeting?" James asked quietly. Jerome's eyes widened as if the question had never occurred to him. I'm not sure. The Miller farm looked different under the harsh glare of police floodlights. What had seemed like a forgotten piece of rural Georgia in daylight now felt like a crime scene waiting to reveal its secrets. James stood at the edge of the excavation area, watching the forensics team prepare their equipment with the methodical precision of people who had done this too many times before. Sheriff Reeves approached him, her breath visible in the cool night air. Ground-penetrating radar showed significant soil disturbance about 20 feet behind the barn. Could be old septic lines, could be something else. The something else hung between them like a prayer neither wanted to voice. James had been preparing himself for this moment since the phone call 3 days ago. But standing here in the darkness, listening to the generators hum and watching technicians mark off grid patterns, he felt like that 15-year-old boy again, helpless and terrified of what the adults might find. Dr. Sarah Kim, the forensic anthropologist, emerged from the back of her van carrying a toolkit that looked more suited to archaeology than police work. She was a small woman with steady hands and patient eyes, the kind of person who could coax truth from bones and soil. "We'll start with careful excavation," she explained to James and the sheriff. "If there are remains here, we want to preserve every piece of evidence. This could take hours." James nodded, though his throat felt too tight to speak. Behind him, Deputy Martinez was stringing crime scene tape, while 2 other officers established a perimeter. The barn loomed in the background like a silent witness, its weathered walls holding shadows that seemed to shift in the artificial light. The first shovelful of earth came up dark and rich. Georgia clay that had been undisturbed for decades, until tonight. Dr. Kim worked with a small hand trowel, removing soil in careful layers and sifting each scoop through a fine mesh screen. The work was painstaking, hypnotic in its rhythm. "Here," she said quietly after 20 minutes of digging. Fabric. James stepped closer despite himself. In the beam of Dr. Kim's flashlight, he could see a corner of cloth emerging from the earth. Dark material that could have been anything, or could have been everything he'd been dreading to find. Sheriff Reeves placed a warning hand on his arm. "Let her work, James." More fabric appeared, then something that made Dr. Kim pause and call for additional lighting. In the sudden brightness of the portable flood lamps, James saw what had stopped. A human skull, perfectly preserved in the Georgia clay, staring up at them with empty sockets that seemed to ask the question James had been carrying for 37 years. Who did this to me? Sunset Manor smelled of disinfectant and memories, a combination that made James's chest tighten as he followed the nurse down the sterile hallway. The discovery of his father's remains had accelerated everything. Sheriff Reeves was now treating this as a homicide investigation, and every lead needed to be pursued before time claimed more witnesses. Roy Higgins sat in a wheelchair by the window of the common room, his weathered hands folded over a blanket that had seen better days. At 89, he was one of the few people still alive who might remember the summer of 1987. The nurse had warned James that Roy's memory came and went like radio stations in a storm, sometimes crystal clear, sometimes lost in static. "Mr. Higgins." James approached carefully, not wanting to startle the old man. "I'm James Washington. I called yesterday about my father, Reverend Samuel Washington." Roy's roomy eyes focused on James with surprising sharpness. "Samuel's boy. You look just like him, you know. Same strong jaw, same way of standing like you're ready to take on the world." James felt a surge of hope. Today was apparently one of Roy's good days. He pulled up a chair, noting how the old farmer's gaze kept drifting toward the window that overlooked rolling hills, similar to his old property. "Mr. Higgins, you told the police in 1987 that you saw something unusual at the Miller farm. Can you tell me about that night?" Roy's face clouded momentarily, as if he was accessing files stored deep in his mind. "The Miller place. Lord, I haven't thought about that in years. Old Henry's spread backed up to mine, you know. I could see his barn from my back porch." "What did you see that night?" "Lights," Roy said slowly. "Bright lights moving around that barn at 2, maybe 3 in the morning. Henry wasn't much for late-night farming, so it struck me as odd. Then I heard the sound." James leaned forward. "What kind of sound?" "Digging. The steady rhythm of shovels hitting dirt. I almost went over to check, but—" Roy's voice trailed off, and for a moment James feared he was losing him to the fog that claimed so much of his past. "But what, Mr. Higgins?" Roy's eyes snapped back to focus, suddenly filled with an emotion James couldn't quite identify. Fear, regret. "But I saw who was doing the digging. 2 men working by flashlight. One of them was Henry Miller himself." James's pulse quickened. "And the other man." Roy was quiet for so long that James wondered if the conversation was over. Then the old farmer spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. The other man was wearing a police uniform, badge glinting in the flashlight beam. The words hit James like a physical blow. A police officer had been at the Miller farm the night his father disappeared. "Are you certain it was a uniform?" "Son, I may be old, but I know what I saw. That man was law enforcement." Roy reached out and grasped James's wrist with surprising strength. "I told them detectives all this back then. They said I was mistaken, that the shadows were playing." Tricks on an old man's eyes. James thought of Detective Brennan's dismissive attitude, the thin case file, the missing evidence. "Do you remember which officer it was?" Roy's grip tightened. Never could see his face clear enough to say for certain, "But I'll tell you one thing, boy. Whoever it was, they wanted your daddy to stay buried." The basement of Mount Calvary Baptist Church was a forgotten catacomb of church history, filled with boxes of records that hadn't seen daylight in decades. Mrs. Dorothy Ellis led the way with a flashlight, her pink church hat slightly askew as she navigated between stacks of moldering documents and discarded Sunday school materials. "After what you told me about Roy Higgins," she said, her voice echoing off the concrete walls, "I remembered something. Your daddy was real concerned about the church finances those last few weeks. Kept asking me about old board meeting minutes." James followed her deeper into the basement, Pastor Jerome trailing behind with obvious reluctance. The air was thick with dust and the musty smell of papers that had been storing secrets for far too long. "Dorothy, I'm not sure this is appropriate," Jerome said, his voice tight with anxiety. "These are church records. There are privacy concerns." "Privacy?" Mrs. Ellis whirled around, her eyes flashing with an anger James had never seen from the gentle church mother. "Child, we buried that boy's daddy without ever knowing the truth. Privacy went out the window the day they found Samuel's bones." She stopped before a stack of water-stained boxes marked Board Minutes 1985-1990. The cardboard was deteriorating, held together more by habit than structural integrity. Mrs. Ellis began pulling out manila folders, their contents yellowed and brittle. "Here," she said, handing James a folder marked June 1987. "Your daddy brought this to my attention right before he disappeared. Said something wasn't adding up in the building fund." James opened the folder carefully, the pages crackling under his touch. The minutes were typed on an old manual typewriter, documenting discussions about a new fellowship hall that was supposed to cost $75,000. But as he read further, his blood began to boil. The same project appeared in multiple meetings with different price quotes: $75,000 in June, $85,000 in July, $95,000 in August. But according to the treasurer's report, over $120,000 had been collected for the building fund. "Where did the extra money go?" James asked, looking up at Jerome, whose face had gone pale. Mrs. Ellis pulled out another folder, this one containing bank statements. "Your daddy found these hidden in the safe. Money was being transferred to personal accounts." She pointed to a series of withdrawals. Frank Daniels was board chairman then. Detective Brennan was on the finance committee. The name hit James like a sledgehammer. Detective Brennan, the same man who had dismissed the investigation, who had insisted his father had simply left town, had been stealing from the church, and Samuel Washington had discovered it. "My father was going to expose them," James said quietly, pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. Jerome sank onto a dusty folding chair. "The night he was supposed to meet with me, he said it was about moving forward with my ordination, but maybe—" His voice broke. "Maybe he was going to tell me about the corruption first. Make sure I understood what I was inheriting." Mrs. Ellis nodded grimly. "Your daddy was planning to present this evidence to the congregation that Sunday. Frank Daniels and Harold Brennan would have lost everything, their reputations, their freedom." James stared at the documents in his hands, finally understanding why his father had to die. They killed him to keep their secret. Sunday morning at Mount Calvary Baptist Church felt different. The usual warmth that filled the sanctuary seemed strained, electric with tension that had nothing to do with the Holy Spirit. James sat in the front pew, his father's pew, with the stolen church documents spread across his lap, and Sheriff Reeves positioned discreetly near the back doors. Pastor Jerome stood at the pulpit, his sermon about truth and reconciliation taking on meanings the congregation couldn't yet understand. But James wasn't listening to the words. His eyes were fixed on Frank Daniels, sitting 3 rows back with the same self-satisfied expression he'd worn for decades as Mount Calvary's most respected deacon. Daniels was 78 now, his hair white as communion bread, and his reputation as spotless as his pressed suit. He'd served on every church committee, led countless Bible studies, and buried James's father's truth along with his body. When Jerome finished his sermon and called for the closing hymn, James stood. The folder in his hands felt like it weighed, more than his father's casket. "Before we sing," James said, his voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary, "I have something to say." The congregation turned as one, their faces reflecting confusion and curiosity. Jerome's eyes widened with alarm, but James was already walking toward the pulpit, toward the same spot where his father had planned to deliver his final sermon. 37 years ago, my father, Reverend Samuel Washington, was murdered because he discovered that members of this church's leadership were stealing from the building fund. James's voice grew stronger with each word. Over $45,000 was embezzled by men who sat in these pews every Sunday, who led prayers and took communion while robbing from God's house. The sanctuary erupted in gasps and murmurs. Mrs. Ellis pressed her hand to her heart, tears already streaming down her cheeks. But Frank Daniels remained perfectly still, his face a mask of practiced innocence. "That's a serious accusation, young man," Daniels said, rising slowly. "Do you have any proof of these wild claims?" James held up the bank statements. "I have proof that you and Detective Harold Brennan systematically stole from this congregation. I have proof that my father discovered your theft and was planning to expose you." Sheriff Reeves began moving down the center aisle, her hand resting on her radio. The congregation seemed to sense that something monumental was happening, that the foundations of their community were shifting beneath their feet. Daniels's mask finally slipped, revealing the calculating mind beneath. "Your father was a troublemaker," he said coldly. "Some secrets are better left buried." The admission hung in the air like incense, heavy and inescapable. Not in The fluorescent lights in the police station interrogation room cast harsh shadows across Frank Daniels's weathered face. His hands shook as he reached for the paper cup of water Sheriff Reeves had provided, the same hands that had counted stolen money and signed false documents for 37 years. James sat across the table, watching the man who had destroyed his family finally crumble under the weight of his own guilt. The church documents lay spread between them like evidence at the final judgment. "I never meant for anyone to get hurt," Daniels whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the recording equipment. "It started small, just a few $100 here and there. Harold said no one would notice." Sheriff Reeves leaned forward. "Tell us about the night Reverend Washington died." Daniels closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, James saw the frightened young man he must have been in 1987. Samuel called an emergency board meeting for that Friday night, said he had discovered financial irregularities and wanted to discuss them before Sunday service. "But you and Detective Brennan already knew what he'd found," James said, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. "Harold panicked, said if Samuel exposed us, we'd both go to prison. Harold was already in debt from gambling, and I had been skimming money to pay for my mother's medical bills." Daniel's voice broke. "We decided to confront Samuel first, try to reason with him." The confession poured out in broken fragments. How they'd met Samuel at the church that night, how the conversation had escalated when Samuel refused to cover up their crimes, how Detective Brennan had struck Samuel during the argument, and Samuel had fallen, hitting his head on the corner of the altar. "He was still breathing when we carried him out," Daniel said, tears streaming down his cheeks. "Harold said we had to finish it, said no one would believe it was an accident now. So we—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "I strangled him," Sheriff Reeves said quietly. Daniels nodded, his body shaking with 37 years of suppressed guilt. "Harold had access to the Miller farm through some arrangement with Henry Miller. We buried Samuel behind the barn that same night, then went back for his choir robe and personal items later." James felt something breaking inside his chest, not his heart, but the hard shell of anger and bitterness he'd carried for decades. His father hadn't abandoned him. His father had died trying to do the right thing. 2 hours later, James stood at the edge of Peaceful Rest Cemetery, watching workers lower his father's remains into the ground beside his mother's grave. Pastor Jerome spoke words of comfort, but James barely heard them. For the first time in 37 years, he felt his father's presence, not as a ghost or a memory, but as a legacy of integrity that no amount of corruption could destroy. Sheriff Reeves approached as the service concluded. "Brennan died in Florida 5 years ago," she said softly. "But justice isn't always about punishment, James. Sometimes it's about truth." James nodded, placing a white rose on the fresh earth. "Welcome home, Dad." 3 months after Frank Daniels' confession, James Washington stood at the doors of Mount Calvary Baptist Church on a Sunday morning that felt like the first day of creation. The sanctuary was fuller than it had been in years, filled with people who had come not just to worship, but to witness the healing of a community that had been broken for nearly 4 decades. Pastor Jerome had asked James to deliver the morning message, a request that would have terrified him 6 months ago. But the man who walked to his father's pulpit was no longer the bitter, faithless son who had avoided church for 37 years. He was Samuel Washington's boy, carrying his father's legacy forward into the light. My father stood in this exact spot in June of 1987, James began, his voice steady and clear. He was preparing to deliver a sermon about courage, the courage to speak truth even when it costs everything. He never got to preach that sermon, but his life became the message. In the third pew, 10-year-old Marcus Johnson sat fidgeting beside his grandmother, his attention drifting between James's words and the colored light streaming through the stained glass windows. The boy reminded James of himself at that age, restless, questioning, searching for something to believe in. Some of you knew my father personally, James continued. Others have only heard stories. But what matters isn't the man we remember, it's the faith he lived, the integrity he died for, and the God he served even when serving cost him his life. Mrs. Dorothy Ellis dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, her pink hat slightly askew as always. Around her, the congregation listened with the intensity of people who had been waiting decades for this moment of reconciliation. After the service, as the congregation filed out into the Georgia sunshine, young Marcus approached James with the shy curiosity of childhood. "Mr. Washington, my grandmama says your daddy was a hero, is that true?" James knelt to the boy's level, seeing his father's eyes reflected in this child's earnest face. "Marcus, heroes aren't people who never get scared or never make mistakes. Heroes are people who choose to do what's right even when it's hard. Are you going to be the new preacher?" Marcus asked. James looked around the sanctuary, at the pews where his father had served, at the pulpit where truth had finally been spoken, at the faces of people who were ready to move forward together. For the first time in 37 years, he felt the familiar stirring of a call to ministry. "I think I might be," he said, and the words felt like coming home. Outside, church bells rang across the valley, calling the faithful